So components of a research poster. So what makes up a research poster? So let's jump into that. So here is a sample research poster. I believe this sample is from last summer, or it might be from the academic year undergraduate research journal. As you can see here, this poster is trying to do like a 50-50 text to image ratio. So your poster is a visual story. So you don't want to have a ton of text on there. You obviously need some text. You need some explanations. You need some, some labels. But you're hoping that the images and the visual story can tell itself with limited text. So this is a sample here. Obviously, there is a title at the top of the poster. We'll get into each of these components in more detail in the following slides. So there is authors and affiliation. So right under the title are usually a series, a list of authors. So you are not the sole person who worked on this research project. You have to give credit to your daily lab supervisor. You have to give credit to your collaborators. You have to give credit to the faculty advisor. Even if the faculty advisor never picked up a test tube or wrote a word on the poster, you still have to give them credit, right? Because it's their lab, it's their graduate student, it's their dissertation project, etc. So you have to give proper reference and credit to the affiliations. That includes funding sources, and I'll talk about that later. Obviously, there is an introduction section, see here to the left, and then there is a materials and methods section, which is kind of methods down here. So this poster kind of flows downward and then upward. So it has like a zigzag shape to it, okay? So that's something to think about in how you want to design your poster. And how is it going to flow? Is it going to flow left to right and then down here left to right? Or is it going to flow, in this case, introduction, then materials and methods, and then results, and then discussion, and then conclusion, and then acknowledgements, right? So the flow of your poster is very important, and you get to decide exactly how that goes. But the results section here is this middle portion here, and you see it's mostly figures, mostly data, mostly tables. And then you have a conclusion discussion section. So this is the discussion, this is the conclusion, and then last but not least, you have to have acknowledgements there. So you have to give proper acknowledgements to the funding sources and to the people who paid for you to do this research, because all research is paid for. No research is done in a vacuum for free without any affiliations. So you have to give proper acknowledgements. And that includes our Summer Undergraduate Research Program. And then sometimes you have references, right? So you have the papers that you've cited, or if there's a special technique that you use that somebody else deserves credit for, you have to have those references included. So those are all the basic pieces of the poster. What I'm going to do now is actually break down each one of them and see if you have any questions. So let's talk first about the title. Obviously, it needs to be concise and catch the attention of the reader. This is very difficult to do. I would say 90% of the titles I read are not very concise, and they don't catch the attention of the reader. So this is a huge challenge, because you're trying to get a 10-week research project wrapped up into one title, which is difficult to do. But needless, you obviously have to try. You have to have a list of all the authors, everybody who contributed to the study, including your PI and your graduate student and your partners. Typically there's at least 4, 5, 6, sometimes up to 8 names on these posters. And so you will have to get some guidance from your graduate student, your daily lab supervisor, and your faculty advisor on who should be listed besides you and your SURP partner if you have one. But basically everybody who's contributed in some way needs to be listed. And of course, affiliations. So your faculty advisor is part of a school. They are part of a department. If there is additional funding for this research, like from another faculty advisor, so then you have to list them also. And then also the funding source. If this is a National Science Foundation or a National Institute of Health, or if this is funded by the Department of Energy or DARPA or there's so many different funding sources. It's literally limitless. So you have to find out who is funding this research so you can include them. You also have to include us. So we will be putting our logo, the Samueli School of Engineering, and this will say Summer Undergraduate Research Program instead of Undergraduate Research Program. So you need to include our logo on your poster. And that is definitely part of the affiliations and the funding sources for your research this summer. Are there any questions about the title and the top of the poster, the basics? No? Okay. How are we doing on time? Oh, yikes, it is almost 5 o'clock. I better speed it up. Okay, introduction to the poster. So this is, you know, a lot of people copy paste their abstract. They think, oh, just put the abstract in my intro and I'm done, easy peasy. Don't do that. That is really bad. Your abstract will be literally copy pasted on the side of your poster in the research journal. So don't do that. You really need to find a better way to do your introduction. For those of you who are doing your technical presentation, I suggest you use the content that you come up with in your slides. It should encapsulate the critical features of the poster and basically the background information, any prior research knowledge, any introduction of technical terms, and really what the real world application is. So everything that we taught and talked about in the technical presentation lab and the stuff that you're gonna put on your oral PowerPoint, that's the stuff you wanna copy paste into the intro section of your poster, okay? Materials and methods. Obviously your experimental protocol, you know, and this should be a diagram. It should be a flow chart. It should be a visual. You should not just have like a recipe of here are the 12 steps to doing your, you know, to doing your experiment. It should be done in a visual format. And again, model, flow chart, series of bullet points. It really should be a flow chart with labels is what it should be. If there's any materials that are used, you know, any special techniques, any equipment, although most of your, because you're doing remote research, this really shouldn't apply. But you may have to explain an algorithm or explain a code that you use, that you coded this summer. You know, that might be in your materials and methods. But you're not working in a wet lab. You're not working in a physical lab doing an experiment. So really it's gonna be more about, you know, a visual representation of what you did remotely. So basically, what did the researchers do? That's what this section's all about. And like I said in the technical presentation lab, you know, this should be, somebody should be able to read this materials and methods section and be able to replicate your research project. They should be able to redo and validate your results. The results section, so the big key here is having data tables, graphs, and figures. You want those to be clearly labeled. So you want your axes and your units to be clearly labeled. You want to have a descriptive caption under that section saying this is the purpose and the point, right? This is the reason why I included this data on the poster. So that caption is critical. And you'll see that when we show the sample posters, there's different ways to describe those captions and those figures. And that's what's in there. The data analysis is typically not included in the results. So you're not really discussing the data yet. You're just showing here is the data by itself. The next section, the discussion section, sorry, it's not clicking to the next one. Here we go. The discussion section is where you really get to analyze the data. You get to say, okay, here's why the data matters, right? Here's what the data is telling us. And so that's the discussion section where you get to really, you know, go back to the big question that you introduced in the introduction, your hypothesis, and say, this is what we thought was going to happen. Here's what the data reports, and this is what it means, right? And you loop back to this disproves our hypothesis or this confirms our hypothesis. And this is where you really get to talk about why the results matter, right? Like how does this relate to the bigger picture? To the real world application. And typically that means you have to talk about what are the next steps. So what did you learn from this experiment and this project? what does the data tell you? And then now, how does the data lead you in your next step of the project, right? So we learned this, and so the next step of the project is to do this differently based on what we learned and what the data said. And that's what your conclusion is, right? You're talking about next steps, future studies that might result as a result of this project and this data. And that's what your conclusion and discussion is. And you know, sometimes the conclusion in the discussion is, look, we realized we were terribly wrong, and this is not what we thought it was going to be. And now this data tells us that there's a different conclusion, and we need to explore that. Like, we're going to totally shift directions 180 degrees and go in the opposite direction of where we were going, because the data tells us that we need to go in a different direction. And that's perfectly okay. In fact, a lot of the major discoveries in science have been as an error, as a result of like, oh man, I messed up, and I have, you know, I was totally wrong, but this new thing I just discovered is pretty cool. So let's figure what that's about. And that leads to a new area of research. You know, there's a lot of success and a lot of publications in those new areas of research. And last but not least are the acknowledgements and references. And this is where you want to have logos of those funding agencies. You want to have our logo for our Summer Undergraduate Research Program. You need to acknowledge your professor, obviously, your lab, and all the funding sources, like I mentioned before. And then the references are basically, make sure your citations are consistent. You know, whatever format you decide to use, MLA or some other format, make sure you use the same format. And we talked a lot about this in TPL #1. So if you haven't watched that video yet, or if you forgot, you can rewatch the video. It's posted on our website. Go back to Technical Presentation Lab #1, and we talk about how you can make sure that you get the proper citations and cite them properly. So that's your references. So those are all the different components of a poster.